Hauptmann Erich Vogel was staring at the ocean when it broke the rules of reality. It was June 6, 1944, just before dawn, on the rocky bluffs west of Courseulles-sur-Mer. The night mist still clung to the coastline like a damp shroud, blurring the horizon into nothingness. The channel was supposed to be empty at this hour, cold, silent, obedient. Instead, it was moving. At first, Vogel thought his eyes were betraying him. He lowered his binoculars, wiped the lenses with his glove, and raised them again. The shape was still there. Then another. Then dozens more. What he was seeing did not resemble a fleet. It resembled a continent drifting toward him. Dark silhouettes stretched from one end of the horizon to the other, ships layered behind ships, steel stacked upon steel. As the mist thinned, masts, funnels, and hulls emerged like the skyline of a city rising from the sea. The water itself seemed to vanish beneath them. Vogel felt his stomach tighten. This was not a raid. This was not a diversion. This was the war arriving all at once. Long before the beaches would earn names like Gold or Juno, before newspapers would invent legends and historians would argue over maps, Erich Vogel understood one simple truth. Germany could not stop what was coming. To grasp the shock of that morning, you have to understand the illusion that surrounded Fortress Europe in early 1944. From Denmark to the Bay of Biscay, German engineers had poured concrete into the coastline, transforming beaches into killing zones and cliffs into fortresses. The Atlantic Wall was sold as unbreakable, an iron spine guarding the Reich from invasion. Posters said it was invincible. Briefings said it was prepared. Berlin said the enemy would bleed to death on the sand. But Vogel had learned, the hard way, that slogans collapse faster than bunkers. At 34, he had survived 2 winters on the Eastern Front. He had seen unbreakable lines vanish in days and decisive weapons abandoned in the snow. He knew that war did not reward confidence, it punished it. His assignment was an artillery position belonging to the 716th Infantry Division, dug into reinforced concrete overlooking the approaches to the Norman coast. The guns were solid but old. The ammunition adequate, not abundant. The men under his command were a patchwork of wounded veterans, exhausted reservists, and boys who had barely learned to shave. Every day was the same routine. Range calculations. Equipment checks. Endless hours watching an empty sea. They spoke of Der Angriff, the invasion, as if it were a rumor, a ghost story told to keep men alert. German intelligence insisted the real blow would fall farther north, at the Pas de Calais. That was where the armored reserves waited. That was where the Reich expected history to happen. Normandy, they said, was a distraction. Standing in his observation bunker as the impossible armada advanced, Vogel realized the truth with chilling clarity. The enemy had not chosen the obvious path. They had chosen the fatal one. And the Atlantic Wall, so proud on paper, was about to be tested by a force unlike anything Europe had ever seen. The Atlantic Wall was never truly a wall. From a distance, on maps, in briefings, in speeches, it looked solid. Continuous. Invincible. But up close, to men like Erich Vogel who lived inside it, the truth was obvious. It was a mosaic of concrete and compromise. Some bunkers were unfinished, their rebar still exposed like broken bones. Minefields existed more on paper than in reality, interrupted by gaps wide enough for a man who knew the land. Fields of fire overlapped poorly. Entire strongpoints could be cut off, surrounded, and left to rot without support. Vogel knew every weakness. He had walked the hedgerows at night. He had watched Norman farmers move through places that were supposed to be impassable. He had memorized the blind angles where his guns could not reach, the folds in the terrain where an enemy could disappear. That knowledge bred no comfort, only doubt. Against probing raids or small landings, the defenses might hold. But against a deliberate, overwhelming assault? Vogel was not convinced. Experience had taught him that walls do not stop armies, timing does. In the weeks before June, tension had tightened like a drawn wire. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, newly responsible for the coastal defenses, had arrived like a man racing against fate. He drove units mercilessly, demanded speed, ordered beaches transformed into traps. Steel stakes were hammered into the sand at angles meant to tear open landing craft. Mines were buried everywhere, millions of them. The soldiers joked grimly, calling the obstacles Rommel's garden. Rommel understood something many in Berlin did not. If the Allies were not destroyed on the beaches, they would not be destroyed at all. Once ashore, Allied aircraft would dominate the skies. Roads would become death corridors. Any German unit moving toward the coast would be spotted, bombed, and erased. The battle would be decided in the first day, perhaps the first hours. Then, on June 5, nature seemed to intervene. The channel turned hostile. Wind whipped the sea into whitecaps. Rain slashed the coast. German meteorologists delivered reassuring reports: no invasion was possible under such conditions. Not now. Not for days. The tension loosened. Senior officers left their posts. Some attended exercises inland. Others traveled. Rommel himself departed for Germany, convinced the weather had bought them time. The storm, they believed, was an ally. By the early hours of June 6, it had eased, but the sea remained restless, heavy and unpredictable. For Vogel, standing in his observation bunker as darkness thinned into gray, the atmosphere felt ordinary. Another watch. Another false alarm waiting to happen. He was scanning east when something disturbed the pattern. At first, it was nothing more than a shimmer, a disruption in the empty geometry of sea and sky. Vogel paused. Adjusted his stance. Raised his binoculars. The slow heartbeat of routine vanished. What he saw did not belong there. Not a patrol. Not a scouting force. Not even a fleet. It was numbers beyond counting. Ships, hundreds of them, cut through the water in rigid formations. And behind them, more shapes emerged. Then more still. Vogel swept his binoculars across the horizon, left to right, searching desperately for an end. There was none. The sea itself seemed to have solidified into steel. Landing craft. Destroyers. Massive silhouettes moving with unstoppable intent. The channel was no longer water, it was a moving surface of war. A cold pressure settled into Vogel's chest. This was not fear in the ordinary sense. It was something deeper. The sensation of a man staring at a calculation so vast, so unbalanced, that no solution existed. He lowered the binoculars slowly. The Atlantic wall, with all its concrete and steel, suddenly felt very thin. And history was already coming ashore. For several seconds, Erich Vogel simply stood there, frozen. His mind refused to accept what his eyes were reporting. The scale of it violated everything he knew about war, logistics, even geography. German planners had spoken of an invasion force, 2,000 ships, perhaps 3 at the absolute most. An effort so vast it would strain Allied resources to the breaking point. This was something beyond planning. This was excess. He tried to count, then stopped. Counting required limits. What lay before him had none. His instincts took over, sorting shapes instead of numbers. Heavy warships sat deep in the water, battleships and cruisers, immovable as islands. Sleeker destroyers carved fast, protective arcs around them, alert and predatory. And between them all flowed the rest. The countless rest. Landing craft in endless variations, flat, narrow, box-like, pressed together so tightly they seemed welded into a single advancing mass. It looked less like a fleet and more like a force of nature, drawn forward by an invisible pull. Vogel blinked hard. Wiped condensation from the lenses. Looked again. Nothing vanished. As the sun climbed, the silhouettes sharpened. Funnels. Antennas. Wake lines cutting white scars into the sea. What had seemed unreal in the half-light now became undeniable in full morning. Years later, historians would reduce this moment to a number, nearly 7,000 vessels, sailing under the flags of 8 nations. They would call it the largest amphibious operation ever attempted. But standing on that bluff, Vogel felt no awe for statistics. He felt outmatched by an entire civilization. Germany had fortified a coastline. The Allies had mobilized an industrial world. He reached for the field telephone, his fingers slick despite the cold. Observation Post 3 to Sector Command, he said, forcing his voice steady. I have full visual on the channel. Enemy naval presence confirmed. The reply came sluggish, irritated. Understood. Recon reports minor activity. Possibly a diversion. Maintain observation. Vogel inhaled sharply. No, he said, louder now. This is not minor. This is not a raid. I am observing a mass formation, hundreds, no, thousands of vessels. Silence. Then, skepticism edged with annoyance. Captain, Sea State makes large-scale landings unlikely. Higher command assesses. Your assessments are wrong, Vogel cut in, the words spilling out before he could stop them. The water is black with ships. I cannot see open sea in any direction. This is the invasion. Another pause. Longer this time. He could imagine the man on the other end, tired, half-dressed, trying to reconcile reports with doctrine. Trying to fit reality into expectations. For God's sake, Vogel snapped, go outside and look. The line went dead. Vogel slammed the receiver down, breath coming fast. The truth was too vast, too sudden. No one wanted to be the first to say it aloud. He switched lines, dialing directly to regimental headquarters. Vogel speaking, he said. Sir, the enemy fleet is in position. A measured voice answered. Calm. Unconvinced. Estimate? Vogel hesitated, then gave up on precision. Thousands of ships, he said. More than we prepared for. More than we imagined. A scoff, barely concealed. Captain, be specific. Vogel looked back through his binoculars. The horizon was gone, erased beneath steel. Then write this down, he replied quietly. The Atlantic Wall is about to be tested by the weight of the world. This time, there was no immediate response. And for the first time that morning, Erich Vogel knew he had been believed. Are you absolutely certain, Captain? The voice on the line still carried doubt, clinging to procedure like a life raft. Vogel did not look away from the binoculars. The weather is clear enough to see the end of everything we prepared for, he replied coldly. And it is sitting in the channel. I am requesting authorization to fire. This time, the silence was different. Not dismissive. Not bored. Frozen. The German command structure was choking on its own assumptions. Plans, timetables, intelligence summaries, entire folders of certainty, were collapsing under the simple weight of what Vogel was observing. Inland, reports of airborne landings were pouring in. Paratroopers in the dark. Scattered fighting behind the lines. High command convinced itself that this must be the real threat. The sea, somehow, was still being ignored. Vogel did not wait. He turned from the telephone and shouted into the bunker corridors, his voice cutting through concrete and sleep. Combat stations. Live ammunition. This is not an exercise. Men stumbled from their posts, fastening helmets, disbelief written across their faces. Then they looked out. And they understood. The drills ended in that instant. Shells were hauled up from the magazines, heavy, unforgiving cylinders of steel. Range officers called out distances so vast they sounded absurd. Elevation wheels turned. The long barrels of the guns, dormant for months, rose slowly toward the horizon. Vogel steadied his binoculars. Out on the water, the fleet was changing shape. Landing craft were peeling forward, forming ordered lines. The sea vibrated, not with waves, but with sound. Thousands of engines merged into a single, low resonance that pressed against the chest. It felt alive. Not a fleet. A mechanism. A world moving with intent. For one brief moment, Vogel hesitated. Then the order came, clipped and unmistakable. Fire at discretion. The hesitation vanished. Open fire. Vogel bellowed into the phone. The first gun answered with a concussion that shook dust from the ceiling. Then another. Then the full battery joined in. The bunker trembled as shells hurled themselves toward the horizon, screaming through the air. Vogel tracked their flight. Water erupted in towering white columns, near misses. Corrections were shouted. Angles adjusted. The guns settled into a practiced rhythm, the kind born of endless repetition. Then he saw it. A shell struck true against a fast-moving escort vessel, an American destroyer cutting through the screen. There was a sharp flash, a bloom of flame, and dark smoke poured upward. The ship began to slow, listing slightly as it fell out of formation. From Vogel's vantage point, it was undeniable. They had hit something that mattered. A raw cheer burst from the gun crews. For a heartbeat, it felt like balance had returned to the world. Training meant something. Skill meant something. They were not helpless observers, they were participants. A battle, real and measurable, had begun. But the moment passed almost as soon as it formed. The damaged ship vanished behind curtains of smoke and spray. The formation closed ranks around the gap. The advance did not pause. It did not hesitate. It absorbed the blow and continued forward. Again and again, Vogel's guns fired. Again and again, shells fell among the ships. And still the armada moved, vast and indifferent. For every vessel disrupted, dozens more pressed ahead untouched. The scale erased effort. Vogel lowered his binoculars slightly and looked beyond his own impacts. Beyond his battery. Beyond what any single unit could influence. The truth settled over him with crushing clarity. This was not a contest of courage or competence. This was arithmetic. And he was trying to subtract the ocean with a single cup. The great ships offshore began to turn. Vogel recognized them immediately, not by name, but by presence. Vast hulls shifting angle, deliberate and unhurried. The kind of movement that belonged to confidence. Battleships were aligning their broadsides toward the coast. Then came the answer. At first, it was only a distant vibration, so low it felt more than it sounded, like pressure building inside the chest. On the horizon, brief flashes bloomed from the ships, sharp and white, like heat lightning trapped at sea. A heartbeat later, the world around Vogel came apart. The air screamed. The ground convulsed. Columns of earth detonated across the fields and hedgerows. Concrete cracked. Shockwaves rolled through the bunker, slamming into walls and bones alike. This was not bombardment as he had known it. It was not fire support. It was procedure. A methodical, industrial act of destruction, step by step, section by section. The Atlantic Wall was not being assaulted. It was being dismantled. Vogel forced himself to look beyond the chaos. Where was the response? Where were the armored reserves? Where was the Luftwaffe? He lifted his binoculars toward the sky and felt a hollow chill settle in his stomach. The air was full, but not with German aircraft. Fighters screamed overhead. Bombers droned in tight formation. Transport planes streamed inland in endless chains. The sky belonged entirely to the enemy, layered with motion, sound, and inevitability. German doctrine demanded counterattack. Armor was supposed to surge forward, smash the beachhead, throw the invaders back into the sea. But the nearest panzer division sat frozen, waiting for authorization that had to crawl its way through layers of command all the way to Hitler himself. When the order finally came, it came too late. The tanks advanced without air cover, crawling into a sky ruled by Allied fighter bombers. Vogel did not need reports to know the outcome. He could hear it in the distance, explosions rolling inland, one after another, as steel burned under open skies. Standing amid the thunder of his own guns and the collapsing earth, Vogel understood something with terrifying clarity. This was not a battle of maneuver. This was not a contest of skill. This was annihilation by capacity. The Allies were not trying to outthink him. They were trying to overwhelm the very idea of resistance. As the naval fire intensified, something inside Vogel shifted. The tactical calculations, the angles, the ranges, the corrections, fell away. In their place came a colder, sharper awareness. He was no longer seeing ships or soldiers. He was seeing systems. Behind the warships, he imagined factories stretching for miles. Assembly lines that never slept. Cities devoted entirely to production, engines, trucks, ammunition, aircraft, produced in numbers that defied comparison. This invasion was not a gamble. It was the logical output of an economy mobilized for total war. He looked back to the sky, where transport planes passed in endless succession, escorted by fighters that never seemed to run out. On this single day, German aircraft would appear only in handfuls, brave, isolated, and hopelessly outnumbered. The imbalance was not about courage. It was arithmetic. One side counted what it could spare. The other counted what it could produce. Vogel tightened his grip on the binoculars as another wave of shells screamed overhead. He thought of German tanks, machines he respected, machines with reputations forged in earlier years. But reputation meant nothing now. Because reputation could not compete with quantity. And as the steel rain continued to fall, Erich Vogel finally grasped the truth that would define Normandy, and the war itself. The future belonged not to the best weapon, but to the side that could build the most of everything. Vogel had always respected German armor. The great cats of the Reich, the Tiger, the Panther, were engineering marvels. Thick armor. Lethal guns. On paper and in close combat, they inspired fear. Allied crews whispered their names like curses. But standing under the weight of the Allied onslaught, Vogel understood the flaw. Perfection was slow. Perfection was expensive. Perfection did not scale. Each Tiger tank consumed enormous resources, rare materials, skilled labor, endless hours. It was a masterpiece built for a world that no longer existed. Across the Channel, the Allies were doing something far more dangerous. They were building enough. While Germany refined excellence, American factories multiplied adequacy. Assembly lines spat out Sherman tanks by the thousands, simple, reliable, replaceable. One burned. Another took its place. Crews trained faster than Germany could manufacture engines. This was not incompetence. It was strategy. The Allies were not trying to win tank duels. They were planning to drown the battlefield in metal. Vogel had seen production figures before the war, numbers he hadn't truly believed. Now they made terrible sense. No speech, no doctrine, no ideological certainty could argue with output charts climbing month after month. This was the new warfare. Not genius versus genius. But capacity versus limitation. Every promise of ideological triumph collapsed under that realization. The Reich had sworn that unity and resolve would overcome material weakness. That belief shattered now, under naval shells and aircraft that never stopped coming. Conviction could not intercept a bomber. Faith could not disable a battleship. Vogel felt the weight of it pressed down on his chest, not panic, but something colder. A recognition that bordered on the spiritual. He and his men were competent. Disciplined. Brave. And irrelevant. They were going to die not because they lacked skill, but because they existed on the wrong side of an equation decided years earlier in factories, not trenches. The image formed unbidden in his mind, a finely balanced blade, perfectly forged, placed beneath a massive industrial press. The hammer did not care how sharp the sword was. It only fell. He thought of the posters back home. Of speeches promising final victory. Of certainty delivered with absolute confidence. It had not merely been propaganda. It had been bad arithmetic. Someone, somewhere, must have known. The production totals. The fuel shortages. The imbalance. And yet orders had continued to flow downward, carrying millions toward an end already calculated. Perhaps that was why officers had begun breaking in the final year, not from cowardice, but from clarity. They were not fighting armies alone. They were fighting the entire productive engine of the modern world. As the sun climbed higher, abstraction turned into blood. The naval barrage reached full fury, a continuous roar that crushed thought itself. The bunkers shook relentlessly. Dust poured from the ceiling. Instruments rattled uselessly. Through the narrow observation slit, Vogel saw movement on the waterline. Landing craft ground into the sand. Ramps slammed down. Men poured out, Americans, stumbling into the surf under the weight of their packs. The machine guns along the beach came alive. From above, Vogel watched the horror unfold with professional detachment and quiet dread. Lines of men fell. The water darkened. Bodies collected where the waves pushed them back ashore. The defenders of the 352nd Division were doing their duty. They were inflicting terrible losses. And yet, Vogel knew, it changed nothing. Because even as the first waves were cut down, more craft were already approaching. More men were already rising from the sea. The machine did not hesitate. It did not react emotionally. It simply advanced. And for the first time that morning, Vogel realized the cruelest truth of all. Even success, on this day, was meaningless. For a brief, fragile window of time, it looked as if the line might hold. The Americans were pinned against the shingle. Smoke clung to the beach. German machine guns carved lethal corridors through the surf. From above, it appeared that discipline and preparation had bought the defenders something priceless, time. Then the equation reasserted itself. Out on the water, Allied destroyer captains made a decision that defied doctrine and bordered on madness. They drove their ship straight toward the coast, closing the distance until sand scraped steel. Some came so close that their gunners could see individual firing slits in the bunkers. They opened fire at point-blank range. Naval shells slammed directly into German positions, tearing apart embrasures that had been designed to withstand everything except this. One strongpoint after another went silent. What artillery could not reach, the fleet erased personally. From Vogel's observation post, the change was unmistakable. The beach was no longer a stalemate. It was becoming a process. Then the new machines arrived. Vehicles emerged from the sea itself, amphibious trucks climbing out of the surf as if water no longer mattered. Tanks followed, some flailing the ground ahead of them with massive rotating chains, detonating mines in controlled bursts. Others bridged gaps, crushed obstacles, or blasted paths through wire and concrete. These were not improvisations. They were solutions, engineered in advance for this exact moment. Germany had nothing comparable. Below, the battlefield transformed. One by one, German positions were blinded, isolated, and destroyed. Naval fire, tank guns, and aircraft worked in coordination, reducing resistance with mechanical precision. Vogel felt the pressure shift inward. Shells began landing closer to his own battery. Then closer still. A direct hit obliterated one gun pit in a roar of flame and debris. Another emplacement fell silent moments later. The ground shook violently. His telephone lines went dead. Just like that, he was alone. He lifted his gaze to the sky for what he knew might be the last time. It was no longer sky, it was motion. Aircraft layered upon aircraft, moving with relentless order. On the water, fresh waves of landing craft replaced the first, then the second. Beyond them waited the armada itself, unchanged, patient, inexhaustible. A conveyor belt of men, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. On this single day, the Allies would land more armor than Germany could replace in months. The fighting on the beach continued, brutal, chaotic, horrifying. But the decision had already been made. What remained was accounting. Time. Steel. Bodies. The campaign in Normandy would grind on for weeks. The hedgerows would devour men and machines alike. German units would fight with skill and desperation. Some victories would even be won. None of it would matter. Every German tank destroyed was a permanent subtraction. Every Allied tank lost was a temporary inconvenience. Every German soldier killed left a hole that could not be filled. Every Allied casualty was absorbed by reserves waiting just offshore. For Erich Vogel, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that first day, the rest of the war became an aftermath. They fought on out of duty, fear, habit, or loyalty stripped of hope. But belief was gone. It had evaporated with the morning mist on June 6. We often imagine the end of the Third Reich as a long collapse, culminating in ruins and rubble far to the east. But for the men of the Atlantic Wall, the ending arrived all at once. It came with a horizon filled with ships. With a sky owned by the enemy. With the realization that they were not facing an army, but an entire industrial civilization in motion. This was a new kind of war. Not decided by courage alone. Not even by genius. But by factories, logistics, and production lines stretching across oceans. And for one German officer, standing in a shattered bunker and staring through binoculars at a sea that had turned into steel, it was the morning he understood a truth that could not be undone. The war was already over.